Mrs. Lindquist. So we're going to finish up our cosine note. So we're looking at example B. So in this example, why don't you take a moment, identify your A and your B value, and calculate your amplitude and period. So pause the video and see if you can come up with those items. Okay, so you should have come up with it. Your A value is -2 and your B value is 4. So your amplitude, if you said +2, you'd be correct, because the absolute value of -2 is +2. Remember, amplitude is always positive. And for period, our B value is 4, which means we are going to get 4 cycles between 0 and 2 pi. So our period is 2 pi divided by 4. 2/4 reduces to ½ pi. Did you get those right? Okay, so in this table, t is our x, and we have y. So instead of having theta y, we are going to have t comma y. Okay, so let's first talk about our pattern of our y value. So we have a cosine wave, and it has an A value of -2. So where are we going to start with this wave? Well, when our A value is negative, we're actually going to be starting with a minimum. And then we're going to go to a 0, to a maximum, to a 0, and to a minimum. So when we graph this out, it should be a hill. So our minimum is -2, then our y value goes to 0, 2, 0, and then back down to -2. Let's talk about our period now. So our period is ½ pi, so it's pretty small. So we start at 0, and we're going to finish at a ½ a pi. What's halfway between 0 and ½ pi? Well, if you said a quarter pi, that would be correct. Again, that would be a ½ pi times a half. So what's halfway between 0 and a quarter pi? Half of a quarter is an eighth. You could get that by doing ½ pi times 1/4. So that would be pi over 8. And then our last one here, halfway between pi over 4 and pi over 2, so between ½ pi and quarter pi, I can take pi over 2 and times by 3/4. So that's going to be 3 pi over 8. And then, of course, our last one is pi over 2 times 1, which is our ½ pi. Okay, so we're going to just mark out our intervals here. We're going by pi over 8, and we have 2 pi over 8, or pi over 4, 3 pi over 8, and 4 pi over 8, which is ½ pi. Again, we're just counting by pi over 8 is really what's going on. So at 0, we are going to start at a minimum of -2. So 0, -2 is our first point. Pi over 8, we're at 0. At pi over 4, we're up at 2. 3 pi over 8 back to 0. And at pi over 2, we're down to -2. Again, when you draw this, don't make a big spike. It should look like a wave. And again, we can get a second cycle. If we get one in between 0 and ½ pi, we can also get one in between 0 and -½ pi. So go ahead and pause the video and draw a second cycle of cosine. So did you get something that looks like that? Okay, great. Okay, so for example C, it says state the amplitude in the period for y equals the cosine of pi over 3 times theta. So we're not making the graph here. We just need to know what our A and B values are so we can find the amplitude in the period. So what would be our A value? Well, there's a 1 here, so my A value would be 1. And my B value should be pi divided by 3. Okay, so let's talk about amplitude. What do you think the amplitude is? Well, we should be taking the absolute value of A, which is 1. So our amplitude should be 1. Okay, let's look at the period. So the formula for period is 2 pi divided by B. So in this case, we have 2 pi divided by pi over 3. So I'm going to write this out going horizontal. So I have 2 pi divided by pi over 3, which is the same thing as saying 2 pi times the reciprocal of pi over 3, which is 3 over pi. So if we multiply this out, we're going to end up with 6 pi over pi. The pi's are going to cancel out, and we are going to be left with 6. So our period is actually 6 radians. So 6 radians more or less than 2 pi radians. Well, 2 pi radians is 6.28-ish. So 6 radians would be a little bit less. It's just a little bit less than 2 pi. All right, so in example 3, it says write an equation for each cosine function. Well, we know this is a cosine function because at x equals 0, we are starting at a max. So we're going from a max to a max. So that is one cycle of our cosine graph. So what information do you know here? Do you know your amplitude? If we draw the midline of our graph in, the amplitude is the height of the peak. So in this example, it is 3. So amplitude is equal to 3. So what does that give us for our A value? Is it going to be 3 or negative 3? Well, since we're starting with a maximum to a maximum, we're going to go with a positive 3. If we were going from a minimum to a minimum, if this was a hill here, then I would have done a negative 3. Okay, so the next part is getting our B value. So B is the number of cycles we can get in between 0 and 2 pi. If I look at this at 2 pi, I don't even have full cycle in yet. So how long does it take me to complete this full cycle? Well, if we look here, 2 boxes is pi. Another 2 boxes is 2 pi. So another 2 boxes would be 3 pi. So my period is 3 pi. If we want to get B, if you remember from the beginning of the notes, we said that B is equal to 2 pi divided by the period, just like the period is 2 pi divided by B. So in this case, B is going to be equal to 2 pi divided by our period, which is 3 pi. So our pi's are going to cancel out. So B is equal to 2/3. We are going to get 2/3 of a cycle from 0 to 2 pi. So, and that's what we said. It looked like we didn't get quite a full cycle in. We only got to 2 pi, we only got 2/3 of this cycle in. Okay, so now that we know our A value and our B value, we are ready to write our equation. It's going to be y equals A, 3, times the cosine of B theta. So we would have 2/3 times theta. Or you could write 2/3 x, since that's what they use. So this equation could be y equals as well. So either way. Okay, so example 4 says, write a cosine function for each description. Choose A is greater than 0. So our amplitude is 4. So that is going to tell us that our A value is going to be 4. It could have been -4, but they said to choose the A value greater than 0. So we're going to go with A being 4. And then they're giving us our period, but they're not giving us B. So remember, our B value is equivalent to 2 pi divided by the period. So in our case, we are going to have 2 pi divided by 6 pi. Since our period is 6 pi, they're telling us that right here. Our pi's are going to cancel out, and our B is going to be equal to 2/6, which is we're going to reduce to 1/3. So we're going to get 1/3 of a cycle between 0 and 2 pi. And again, we're only going to get 1/3 of a cycle because this period is huge. It's 6 pi to complete the entire cycle. So it takes 3 times as long as the normal 2 pi. Okay, so now that we have our A value and our B value, we can write our equation. So go ahead and pause the video and see if you can figure out what the equation is going to be. So we should have y equals A, which is 4, times the cosine of B theta. So B is 1/3, so 1/3 theta. All right, another way of writing this would be y equals 4 cosine of theta divided by 3. So if you see theta divided by 3, that is still 1/3 theta. Okay, so go ahead and pause this video and try example B, and then we will come back and talk about it in a moment. Okay, so let's take a look how you did here. So our amplitude is 2.5. So that means our a value is 2.5. It could also be a negative 2.5. But again, they're asking us to make an a value that is greater than 0. So we have a. And then they're giving us a period of 8 radians. So to get your b value, you're going to do 2 pi divided by your period of 8. So we're going to have 2 pi divided by 8, which is going to reduce to pi over 4. So you're going to get pi over 4 cycles between 0 and 2 pi. Did you get that? I know it's kind of a weird looking answer. So our final equation is going to be y equals 2.5 times the cosine of pi over 4 times theta. So that is a wrap on cosine. All right, you guys. Well, I hope you have a great weekend. We'll see you soon. Bye.